From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
All right, Joe, which is it? President Biden says he's optimistic for a deal on the debt ceiling, while House Speaker Kevin McCarthy says he hasn't seen any real movement. This as the president prepares to leave the country later this week for the G7 meeting in Japan.
Mr. President, have you scheduled a meeting with the Speaker yet for tomorrow, Wednesday? Yes. What day? Tomorrow.
I appreciate the president finally willing to talk after 97 days, but there is no movement.
Treasury Secretary Yellen with a fresh warning this afternoon, reminding the X-date could be as soon as June 1st. We'll talk with Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga of Michigan about where his party is on the negotiations.
Plus, the former heads of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank are set to testify before the Senate Banking Committee tomorrow. We'll discuss the political and regulatory fallout.
And after Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has a weekend of campaigning alone in Iowa, are his odds for taking the Republican presidential nomination improving? Our political panel is with us later this hour. So, Kaylee, here we are again on a Monday with breaking news, and it's back to the X-date. We knew that this would come out at some point this week, but Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen wasting no time in delivering yet another letter.
Yeah, and just reiterating what she had already told Congress, which is that it could be as early as June 1st that the Treasury Department may fail to meet the government's obligations. What I think potentially was the most important part of the letter, though, was she was essentially trying to hint to Congress it's not actually the X-date that matters. It's about getting too close to it. She noted how in past episodes of impasse over the debt ceiling, getting too close can affect borrowing costs, consumer confidence, and ultimately the credit rating of the United States, harkening back to 2011. So
let's get into all of this. Joining us around the table today, Bloomberg News Deputy Managing Editor Wendy Benjaminson and Bloomberg Economics reporter Kate Davidson. It's great to have both of you with us here, and welcome. Kate, I'm going to start with you on this one. New X-date, well, not so new. New letter about the X-date. I guess it's really a kind of a no-news story. But we should note that there were some who thought that that date might be pushed back. What does this tell us?
Right. So Janet Yellen definitely making clear today nothing has changed in terms of the timing that Treasury expects for when this could really become a problem. Although if you read really carefully, there was a slight language tweak. So, the past letter had said that, the Treasury could run out of headroom to pay the government's bills in full and on time as early as June 1st. And I think the previous letter had said, the date on which Treasury might default could come weeks after. The new letter said could come days or weeks after. So it's a tiny difference, but it really suggests that, the date is not some far off, many weeks later. As some folks have suggested, maybe the Treasury has a little bit more wiggle room. She's really doubling down and saying, no, this is serious.
Well, and then, of course, this just tees up the meeting happening tomorrow at the White House, Wendy, because the clock, in theory, maybe is ticking louder. At the same time, you're having House Speaker Kevin McCarthy say things like, there is no agreement on anything. Talks are not productive at all. We're nowhere near coming to a conclusion. It's not the best mood music heading into tomorrow's meeting.
It's really not. And it's really hard to tell who to listen to. I mean, I do think Janet Yellen was trying to turn up the gas on the stove a little bit on them to say, come on, June 1st, not right around the corner. But Biden and Senate Democratic leader Schumer are being very optimistic about this. Kevin McCarthy says, he's in the most apocalyptic terms, we're nowhere. There's no agreement. We do know that Democrats offered to close some tax loopholes. Republicans rejected that out of hand. Democrats rejected, the spending cuts that the Republicans have. Last time we were here, we thought the staff had worked this all out. So this meeting their faces when they come out tomorrow will tell us the story, I think.
How much of this, I wonder, is negotiating through the media, though? Joe Biden's having a nice bike ride. It's Mother's Day. He says, yeah, we're making it. I'm optimistic. Today, Speaker McCarthy shows up on a Monday. There is no deal. He wants to keep pushing, just like Janet Yellen. Is that what this is?
I did think that earlier today when McCarthy was simply saying, yeah, we're not there. Don't be as optimistic as Biden. He does need to prove to his caucus that he is standing tough, that he's going to go with the Freedom Caucus, the right-wing parts of his caucus, that he's going to stand tough with them. And Biden at this point needs to message that he's amenable, that he wants to negotiate after the quote-unquote 97 days that Kevin McCarthy waited to hear from him. So, yes, it very well could be messaging. But then when McCarthy started really saying, I mean it, we are nowhere, I wonder if that's political or real. But it's impossible to tell.
And given that, it's very difficult for the markets and, frankly, for the American consumer to dissect what ultimately is going on. Sure. And on that note, Kate, when we hear Janet Yellen saying things like in this letter, noting how Treasury's borrowing costs for securities that mature in June have gone substantially higher, you're seeing it show up there, but we're not necessarily seeing it show up in broader consumer behavior or the equity market. Does that kind of need to happen and for something to actually get done, that kind of pressure?
Yeah, I mean, that's traditionally what lights a fire under Washington, under Congress, and under the White House. I mean, clearly they're concerned. The White House is concerned. They want to figure this out. But I think that, more broadly, folks just aren't paying attention to this yet because they've seen the show many times before. Maybe they're truly not worried. So, yes, we're seeing it in the bond market and borrowing costs for treasuries, but we're not really seeing the stock market respond very much. And I think that we'll definitely start to see it as we get closer, but how close kind of remains to be seen.
We keep hearing, and we heard it a couple of times on Bloomberg Radio earlier today, Kayleigh, that there's some politics involved here, that Janet Yellen's not going to be honest about the date, that she's moving it up to try to push Republicans to make a deal with the president. We've also heard that there's an algorithm, that this is not Janet Yellen cooking up math in her office alone here. How does it actually work?
So that's true, right? I mean, Treasury has been forecasting the X date for many years, and these are letters that Treasury secretaries regularly put out, in advance of the deadline across, administrations of both parties. So, and it's the staff at the Treasury that work, that work on this. And right, they have an algorithm, they have a model. The problem is that it's just been very tricky for them, basically since the pandemic happened, to accurately forecast how much revenue they're going to take in, and in some instances, how much spending is going to go out the door, because it's just been so volatile.
Yes.
So I think it's been trickier. And so I think that, Secretary Yellen, I mean, just what we know about her from her years as Fed chair and as Treasury Secretary, she is a cautious, conservative policy maker. So I think that when Treasury and the Secretary are communicating this forecast, which comes from, Treasury staff and this algorithm, I think she's also, is it possible she's being perhaps a little bit more cautious and saying, look, we really don't have confidence that we can get through, say, the middle of June, where we'd have an influx of tax payments, and that would carry us a little bit further. Yeah, she might be, but I don't think that anyone, any folks who seriously follow this think that we can make it, say, till the end of July or August. That's just not what people are forecasting at this point. It is very soon.
Okay, so that's obviously the big deadline, the one that we're all watching. But in theory, there's kind of another deadline within this week, Joe, because on Wednesday, the president is supposed to get on a plane for a trip abroad.
Yes.
Wendy, does he still climb the steps of Air Force One and go to Japan if tomorrow doesn't go well?
Well, I think he really wants to. I think he really feels that this G7 meeting is important to him. And of course, we all know presidents can work remotely. They have that big jet. They have, staff and everything with them in Japan at the G7. What he could skip, and what some people think might happen, is that after the G7 meeting in Japan, then there's a trip to Papua New Guinea just to sort of shore up American allyship in the face of China, and a trip to Australia, again, to shore up American allyship with the Quad. Could he skip those and come back? Sure, he could. I really think in terms of voters' minds, voters would like to see him working on the debt ceiling. They really rarely vote on a G7 outcome.
Yeah, everybody's focused on what's going on here at home.
I wonder what kind of a message that would send to the markets, if it would make investors happy. Hey, he's staying here to work on things, or really freak everyone out because, my God, it's worse than we thought. He's canceled the trip.
Well,
if he cancels the trip, that must mean things are really not going well. All right, so stay tuned over the next 24 to 48 hours. Wendy Benjaminson and Kate Davidson, thank you both so much for joining us. And coming up, we'll continue our conversation around the debt ceiling and be joined by Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga of Michigan. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
We're only a couple weeks away. And if you look at the timeline to pass something in the House and pass something in the Senate, you've got to have something done by this weekend. And we are nowhere near any of that.
That was House Speaker Kevin McCarthy earlier today on the state of debt ceiling negotiations, seemingly in contrast to President Biden's more optimistic tone over the weekend. This as Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen reiterated in a letter to Congress last hour that the ex-date could be as early as June 1st. Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga of Michigan is here with us to discuss this issue further. Congressman, thank you so much for your time. We just heard what House Speaker Kevin McCarthy said earlier today. He doesn't sound that optimistic about progress being made. What are you hearing from your colleagues in the House?
A little frustration, frankly, that it took 97 days to get to the negotiations, and we wouldn't be quite in this spot if they had started earlier. That many of us were asking for to happen. And I get it. The president's happy. He had a bike ride and some ice cream this weekend, and he's off to Japan. But that's not the reality of what we're dealing with here on the ground. And I think what Speaker McCarthy had to say is probably more accurately reflecting what's going on.
Congressman, I'd love to know what the communication is like between yourself and the Speaker, the members in the caucus and the Speaker. Now that this process is underway, do you get a readout from the Speaker's office? Do you get a phone call from a staffer? How does someone like yourself, serving on a related committee, the Financial Services Committee, stay in touch with what's going on?
Yeah, well, and there's a couple of different ways. First and foremost, we do have those adjunct people that are in communication with us and our staff. Obviously, we pay attention to the news and what's going on and what gets out, because anything that's secret lasts, about a second to a second and a half before it's out on Twitter and out on social media. But then also, like tomorrow morning, for example, we will be having a conference, which is our weekly conference, our first full day back, 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. The Speaker will address it as he always does, and we'll have some of that focus in on that. So, you know, it's very dynamic as we come back in from being gone over the weekend, and there's a lot of moving parts, obviously. But the communication, frankly, has been, I think, better under Speaker McCarthy and what we've been dealing with than it has been in previous years, and maybe that's because of some of what we had to go through to get to that speakership. I think that's forced some channels of communication open that weren't necessarily always there.
Well, and we know that the Speaker was having to work those communication channels just to get his bill over the finish line to raise the debt ceiling and have those spending cuts along with it. It does raise the question, though, Congressman, that ultimately if he can reach a deal with the White House, which, yes, is an if at the moment, in theory, that's going to take some give and take. So when a deal is made, what would be a deal breaker for you? What would have to be included in it for it to get your vote?
Yeah, the agreements are always moving around. We know that. It was important to get going on that. And my general rule of thumb is if we make progress, I will vote for a debt ceiling increase. If we do not, then I won't. And I've voted for some in the past, most of them, and I've voted against some of them in the past when I haven't seen that willingness to move. So it's really going to be situational, I think. But I will tell you this, a lot of my colleagues are really looking at two things. One, what are those work requirements surrounding federal aid going into people that need help but are able-bodied, aren't head of households, they don't have dependents, they don't have kids that they have to worry about? Are they putting in an educational component or a volunteer component? That I think is an important symbol, but also an important practical element of that. And then the other thing is, and this isn't huge numbers, but again, it might be some important symbolism. mechanism, clawing back of those COVID dollars from states and local governments that have had 2 years to use them and have not used them. That's an important thing to reclaim that as the federal government. Frankly, I'd like to expand it, but that's not going to be happening in this particular negotiation. But that's a start.
Well, that sounds like pretty good news, actually, Congressman. You're pretty close to a deal if that's the case, right? Those have actually all been acknowledged. The president seems open to those. Bloomberg is now reporting as well that permitting reform might be the key that unlocks the rest of this. Is that true?
Well, I was going to, lead into, that's all connected in with H.R. 1, which was our energy and unleashing really the natural resources that we have here in the United States so that we're not so dependent on these foreign adversaries for our energy and for, the various components, those rare earths that are going into so many of the batteries and different things that we have here. And so having that permitting process and unleashing our energy certainly is going to be a very important thing as well. So, there's always those devils that's going to be in the details. So we're waiting for those details. But this is just also, it's a running out of the calendar because that clock continues to tick. And we need a certain amount of time to physically get the paperwork done, the bills read, the bills proofed, getting them into the House, getting them passed, getting them processed and over to the Senate and onto the president's desk. So I know one of your commentators earlier was talking about the president can get on the plane and work from anywhere. That is true, but there's always those last minute things when if you don't have the principals sitting at the table pounding out those last details, it makes it more difficult. So there's things that he can do, and then maybe we got to ask, what should he do?
And Congressman, just finally to shift gears a bit, understood you mean the president who will be sitting around that table or around the couches in the Oval Office tomorrow. Also happening tomorrow in the House Financial Services Committee will be regulators, including the Fed's Vice Chair of Supervision, Michael Barr, the FDIC chair as well. That's tomorrow. On Wednesday, you're going to hear from the former executives of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. What are you looking to hear from them? What information do you need to get? And could it ultimately result in a legislative response to the banking crisis we have seen?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, we need more information. We have a number of letters of requests for information that have either been stonewalled or slow-walked, and that's going to be part of my questioning is, what is the delay? We need this information. I'm glad that there was a report that was done, but it was done by the regulators themselves, right? So we have an obligation and a constitutional obligation at that to go and do our own investigation as to what had happened. So we're going to be looking at timelines, not just with these critical bank failures, but what had been leading up to that, and what were the red flags that were getting posted by regulators as well as outside folks, and then obviously asking the bank's CEOs themselves, and I believe it was Bloomberg had just reported the former SVB CEO was blaming the feds and social media for the collapse of his bank. I would add one, and I wouldn't necessarily throw those out as real reasons, but I think he has to add in bad management on top of that. So bad management, regulators, as well as this new element of Twitter runs happening, certainly all contributed to that.
Well, let's stay in touch on that, Congressman, because I know we have a lot more to learn in the hearings this week. Congressman Bill Huizenga, we thank you for being with us on Bloomberg. Coming up, Fed officials are dominating the calendar this week. Take a look, at least 11 different Fed officials on the calendar. Bostic, Kashkari, and Cook kicking things off today. And our very own Michael McKee spoke with Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic. We'll recap coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
No. Look, in today's environment where there's so much uncertainty in the economy, I don't think we can really rule out anything. If I had to have a vote right now, I'd probably vote to hold. But as you noted, we got 2 more inflation readings. We have a jobs report that's got to come out. There's a lot more information we're going to have as to what's going on.
Was Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic in an interview with our very own Michael McKee at the Atlanta Fed Banking Conference. And for more on Bostic's comments, Michael McKee joins us right now. Michael, thanks for being with us. It sounds like everything is on the table, but a pretty interesting reaction to what if the meeting were today? He would vote to hold rates right where they are.
Yes, he would, but he leaves open the possibility of another rate increase. The oh, no was in response to my question about whether that's off the table. They're still holding out the possibility of a rate increase if additional inflation data come in stronger than expected. The Atlanta Fed has what they call an underlying inflation tracker dashboard on their website. You can look it up, and it basically shows at this point that most of the Atlanta Fed indicators that they track show inflation is the same or worse than it was at this time last year. So there's still work to do. Now, the argument is, do you need to just give it more time? That's what some people are saying. But Bostic says he thinks they have made sufficient progress and they can wait and see.
When I think about the trajectory of inflation, I think that we've made a really good progress on that. If you think about where the economy was and where inflation was last summer compared to where it is today, we've seen really positive things happen. We're not at the 9 and 10% levels. We're in 4.5 to 5 range.
But again, the issue is, do they need to do any more? And he said it is possible. And I think that's the thing to watch for from Fed officials this week, and there are so many of them speaking, is the word they're not going to use, pause. They're going to say, at this point, we are keeping our options open. And then they don't want people in the markets to fully price in the Fed not doing anything more.
And yet the market also, Mike, is fully pricing in the Fed turning around and beginning to cut rates by the end of this year, which is something that Bostic has pushed back against. Many Fed officials have, and yet the market doesn't seem to buy it. I have to wonder how the uncertainty around the debt ceiling maybe feeds into that narrative, the idea being if you were to see a downgrade on the U.S.'s credit rating or ultimately even a default in the worst case scenario, that would mean the Fed is going to have to do something.
Yeah, I think that is part of it, Kayleigh, because there is this danger out there, and what you have is investors hedging against it, the idea of a possible default. It isn't going to cost them a lot of money to hedge at this point, but boy, would it if we did go over that line. So you're seeing a little distortion in the Fed funds futures and overnight index swaps markets, and Fed officials know that, and they are fairly convinced that the markets know there's not going to be a cut this year either.
All right, Mike, we'll leave it there. Enjoy it down in Florida. Looking forward to your coverage over the last several days. But, Joe, this really comes back to the larger overarching question is the pressure on these officials as we consider the debt ceiling when markets seem to be saying, you know, it's okay. They do this all the time.
Exactly.
We're never actually going to default.
Well, that's the same market that's betting on rate cuts later this year, right? So I think the Fed has reached quite the disconnect here when it comes to the stock market. But, yeah, when you consider the debt ceiling as an interruption in anyone's ability to forecast anything, whether you're a corporation or a government agency, that's why we're talking about it every day.
And that was what Janet Yellen was warning about in her letter to Congress this afternoon. So coming up, we're going to talk more about the kind of market volatility we could see in response to the ongoing debt ceiling debate. PIMCO's Libby Cantrill will be here with us after the break. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Another important week in Washington upon us now with the debt ceiling debate getting hotter. No less than 3 hearings on the banking crisis in the Senate Banking Committee on reform at the Fed. Here with us to discuss, Managing Director of Public Policy at PIMCO. That, of course, is Libby Cantrill. Libby, it's great to have you. I'm going to start with the debt ceiling here. A week ago in your note to clients, you talked about passing stones, kidney stones, and the pain that ensues. You have now progressed to pearl clutching. And I wonder what's happening in your narrative here from week to week. As you point out, despite the pearl clutching, media hysteria, and doomsday-like odds of default and downgrade, there continues to be progress on a debt ceiling. I wonder what's making you optimistic as the speaker tells us there is no progress.
Yeah, Joe. Well, thank you. We have no lack of colorful language here at PIMCO for sure. But I do think that is what clients should be focused on, and the market should be focused on, is sort of the actions on the ground versus the rhetoric. As we all know, the reality can oftentimes be different from the rhetoric. And of course, I mean, Speaker McCarthy, I think he's alluding to the fact that there has been no exchange of actual paper yet. So all of this is pretty ambiguous and sort of theoretical. But if you actually talk to people on the Hill, if you talk to people who are close to the negotiations or the discussions, however you want to characterize them, there does seem to be quite a bit of progress. And Joe, as we've talked about, there's a real kind of Venn diagram here of overlap in terms of what the contours of a deal could be. Energy permitting reform, unused COVID funds, some spending caps to sort of slow the growth of future spending, what have you. So we think that a deal is likely around the corner, honestly, despite some of the more dramatic rhetoric and some of the pearl clutching, if you will.
Libby, what, though, do you mean by around the corner? What kind of timeline, realistically, are we talking about? As Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen again today warned that it could be as early as June 1st, the potential X date, but that also pushing it too close to the limit can have pretty severe consequences.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think the market, if past is prologue here, the market will start to get jittery should sort of the mood music shift and it become more negative after what looks like tomorrow's meeting between President Biden and Speaker McCarthy. Now, I think ideally the Senate would like to come to a deal by the end of this week because, as you both know, there's a 2-week recess around the corner for the Senate. They'll be out for 2 weeks. The House will be out the week after Memorial Day. So I think that is sort of the de facto X limit, if you will, May 26th. But again, I think that the Senate would prefer to actually reach a deal by the end of this week. And if that's the case, then I think we could actually avoid some of this market volatility that we've seen in the past. Again, that as we talked about before, the Treasury bill market, some of the U.S. CDS market is already sort of dislocated, but the equity market's not really. They've been quite sanguine about this. So again, it's a potential that they could avoid this altogether should there be a deal struck in the next few days.
So at the end of this week in mind then, Libby, how important is it for the markets, for investors like yourself to hear from the players here on at least a framework of a deal before President Biden gets on Air Force One on Wednesday? That means tomorrow's meeting would be of the utmost urgency.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it will be important, like any of these inflection points are important. But of course, in this day and age, just because he's going to be in Asia doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be unreachable or won't be able to negotiate from there. So I would say important. But if there's sort of some negative rhetoric or negative headlines out of tomorrow's meeting, I would just take it all with a grain of salt, again, to use another metaphor here, just because, again, I think that the destination is quite clear, as we've talked about. It's just the road could be a little bit bumpier. So again, if tomorrow the headlines are maybe not as positive as folks would want, I just would take it with a grain of salt and put it into the broader context that everyone wants a resolution. No one on Capitol Hill, or at least very few people on Capitol Hill, and none of the people who actually matter want a default.
Sounds, Libby, like you're saying trust no one, at least for the time being, until everything is inked and set in stone. There is a question, though, and I was asking this of Congressman Bill Huizenga earlier, the idea that a deal being made between McCarthy and the White House is one thing. A deal being sold to the rest of Congress is another. How much difficulty do you think they could have in really what is part two of raising the debt limit?
That's an excellent point. And I would say before we become sort of too quixotic or optimistic about the potential or lack thereof of a market reaction, the market could get jittery because even, of course, if the deal is struck, in theory, then Speaker McCarthy in particular has the difficult job of selling that to his conference on the Republican side. But almost equally so, Hakeem Jeffries on the Democratic side needs to convince his members also to vote for it. That could be a heavy lift, especially among some progressive members, sort of depending on what is actually in the final deal. So each leader will have a difficult time in some ways, but I think The most important thing, again, for what markets and investors need to be focused on is 218. That is the number of votes that a deal needs to get. So as long as they can get sort of the majority of each of their conferences or caucuses, it should be able to have the votes to go forward. But there could be some rockiness and, again, jitteriness in the market between now and then, because that could be a little bit more difficult in practice than maybe it sounds in theory.
Well, Libby, as we're all obsessing over the debt limit, there are a couple of hearings that we're covering this week on Capitol Hill about the banking failures. We'll have officials from SVB and Signature. We'll have Fed officials before hearings on the Senate and the House side. What's going to happen here? Are we beyond expecting any legislative answer to what happened? Is this an exercise in futility?
Well, I don't think it's in futility. I mean, of course, the Congress has the oversight function, and that is an important function, that important role that they play. And I do think that both sides of the aisle will try to rack up some political points here, but also to really substantively try to figure out what exactly happened, both from a management perspective and then also when they have Vice Chair Barr from the Fed and then also Chairman Gruenberg from the FDIC up on the Hill. But to your point, Joe, and to your question, we don't expect really any kind of legislative movement, at least for the foreseeable future here. You know, there was some speculation that maybe you would see the deposit insurance guarantee from $250K increased. We sort of faded that. That just didn't seem like on either side of the aisle was very popular. So really the real action we believe here will be at the Fed, where they already have discretion to reimpose or to impose some of these sort of liquidity and capital restrictions on these kind of regional mid-sized banks.
What about executive compensation clawbacks, Libby? You don't even think even that would make it through?
That's a good question. That could be something, maybe a rider in one of these sort of must-pass bills. I mean, that obviously politically plays quite well. But just in terms of a really big, comprehensive piece of banking legislation, we do not see that. So you're right. That we might see sort of these one-offs, again, that kind of score some political points, but unlikely that we're going to see sort of a more fulsome, bank regulation bill out of Washington anytime soon.
One thing's for sure, I would not want to be the former executives from SVB and Signature having to sit and basically get scolded in these hearings over a several-day period. Libby Cantrill of PIMCO, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. And coming up, we're going to be joined by our political panel to discuss the ongoing talks to avert a historic U.S. default. As we've been saying, Yellen warned again, the U.S. could run out of cash by June 1st. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
Now, keeping up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. I'm John Hyland. Turkey will hold a runoff vote later this month to determine if President Erdogan extends his time in power into a third decade. Although Erdogan was leading the race by more than 2 million votes, it wasn't enough to secure more than 50% of the ballot and avoid a second round. Turkey's market slumped after it became clear the country was headed for a runoff, disappointing investors betting on an end to Erdogan's rule. UK Home Secretary Suella Braverman is ramping up pressure on Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to clamp down on immigration. She warned today that unfettered arrivals to the country pose a threat to what they called the UK's national character. With official statistics next week expected to show record net arrivals in the UK last year, Braverman said the numbers must come down. French President Emmanuel Macron made his pitch today that France is a leading hub for foreign investments and electric cars. He met with Tesla CEO Elon Musk at the presidential palace in Paris to talk about the prospects for development in electric vehicle and energy sectors. A Macron aide says the two also discussed Europe and France's response to President Biden's green subsidy plan, known as the Inflation Reduction Act. And Elon Musk was subpoenaed by the U.S. Virgin Islands in its lawsuit accusing JPMorgan Chase of knowingly benefiting from Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking. The territory said it had reason to believe Epstein referred or attempted to refer Musk to JPMorgan. The USVI asked the judge overseeing the case to authorize alternative means of serving Musk a subpoena after being unable to reach him. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Originals. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm John Hyland, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy says ongoing talks to avert a historic U.S. default are yielding little progress. That's not necessarily what President Biden indicated over the weekend. Of course, they're going to be in a room together tomorrow. So what really will be the outcome? For more, let's bring in Rick Davis, our Stone Court Capital partner and political contributor here at Bloomberg, as well as Jeannie Shanzano, Iona University political science professor. So, Rick, if I could just start with you. It seems like the message we are getting from the different parties is very different, and perhaps we could anticipate that. But at this point, especially as Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is warning again that it could be as early as June 1st, that there are consequences if we get too close to the X date, what should we be believing right now?
Yeah, look, I mean, these are negotiators practicing their craft. Kevin McCarthy, once more, is regardless of what we think they've accomplished so far, I guarantee he's still got things on his plate that he'd like to get into this deal. And so I think he has to keep the heat on. So just like Janet Yellen announced to the world today that the date has not changed. But we had to know that, right? And Kevin McCarthy says, we have no deal. And we had to know that, too. So the only person who seems pretty content riding his bike and eating ice cream is the president, who's probably looking for an exit to go to the G7. And so he doesn't want things to look too rocky. So my guess is we're going to have totally dueling press conferences tomorrow where Kevin McCarthy says, we don't have a deal, and the president says, oh, we're pretty much there. So just depends on what you think is a done deal.
But, Jeannie, everyone's hitting the president on riding his bike and eating ice cream. I figure at least he rode his bike if he's going to eat ice cream. But either way, I'm curious your thoughts on this Janet Yellen letter. People knew it was coming this week. There was a thought that it might move the date back a little bit. So it's kind of a no-news situation, but it's not a good news situation. Did she have to write that today? Did that language resonate with anyone?
You know, I think it's very important that she lets us all know what the date is. And I think, you know, we were all hoping that potentially there was more time because we're facing just a couple weeks now. But she made clear that that's not the case. And so, you know, I think if I was Kevin McCarthy, I would be a bit pessimistic at this point as well. And I'll tell you why. Because even if they get a deal, they come to this negotiation and miraculously they get somewhere. He's still got to get to 218. And you look at what he's going to have to give up, and I can't imagine he does that and holds on to all those Republicans. That means he's got to get over some Democrats or Democrats and a few Republicans, and that means he's facing a real challenge to his speakership. So I don't see how, with so few weeks left, Kevin McCarthy would ever feel optimistic about what's coming down the pike. The president with his ice cream and bicycle, yes. Kevin McCarthy facing the need to get 218, I'm not so sure I would be pessimistic if I was him.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Jeannie. We're so focused on a deal happening between the president and Speaker McCarthy. We have to consider that that deal does need to make its way through Congress to actually become law and for the debt ceiling to actually be raised. With all that in mind, can the president just say, all right, I'm done, good meeting on Tuesday, get on Air Force One on Wednesday and go to Japan? Or are the optics of that now just increasingly difficult, considering it does still have Congress to go through, even if yesterday or tomorrow goes well?
You know, I just don't imagine that the president really can. I think he very much wants to go overseas. I don't think he should unless, you know, we hear something tomorrow that this is, you know, gone splendidly well and it's going to sail through Congress. It's not even possible. So I don't think he should go. I think he should stay, and I think he should see this through. I wouldn't say that if we had 3 more months or maybe even 2 more months. But we're now facing, 15, 16, 17 days? That's a really narrow time frame to do what they have to do, from writing this thing to getting a deal to writing it and then to socializing it and getting to the 218 and the 60. That's an uphill battle.
We've referred to it a couple of times. Let's hear from President Biden. Yes, on the bike ride on Mother's Day. Here's what he said.
It's never as good to characterize a negotiation in the middle of a negotiation. I remain optimistic because I'm a congenital optimist. But I really think there's a desire on their part as well as ours to reach agreement. And I think we'll be able to do it.
Fasten your chin strap, Rick. You've known Joe Biden for a long time. Is he actually being candid in this case? He does seem relaxed, to your point. He doesn't want to have any drama before this meeting tomorrow. So what's going through his mind?
Yeah, look, he's the only one who actually can have confidence that there is going to be a deal, right? He's going to make good on a debt increase. And he's the only one who can give the Republicans what they need to say yes to it. So he can actually feel very confident because he puts his head down on the pillow with or without a helmet on every night. And he actually knows there will be a deal because he'll sign off on something. And so whatever that is. But I would remind everybody, the other people at the table are Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader, and the majority leader of the Senate.
Rarely mentioned.
They sign on to that deal, too. So they have to deliver their caucuses. It's not Republicans just delivering 218 Republicans. It is the entire House of Representatives, hand in hand. There'll be 350 votes for whatever deal comes out of the White House.
Remember that. Rick Davis said it here on Balance of Power. You know, Speaker McCarthy had promised to bring soft food to the last meeting for Joe Biden. Maybe he meant soft serve. I don't know. Coming up, what happens when two political powerhouses head to Iowa, but one cancels because of the weather? That's next on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg TV.
Governing is not about building a brand or talking on social media and virtue signaling. It's ultimately about winning and about producing results.
That was Florida Governor Ron DeSantis campaigning Saturday in Iowa. As we return with our panel, Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner, and Jeannie Shanzano, Iona University political science professor. They are both Bloomberg Politics contributors. Let's start with the governor of Florida here, Rick. I'm not sure who he was referring to there again, but making references like this to Donald Trump constantly without name-checking him is making people wonder if this strategy is ever going to work. They say he's going to announce in the next couple of weeks.
Well, I think also in contrast to what Trump's doing to the governor, because he is just hammering him every hour of the day. And so it just seems like it's not a fair fight where you have one person who has both hands tied behind his back and another one with two 2x4s in his hands. And so, you know, yes, there are a lot of Republicans who I've talked to who said, when's he going to unleash? When's he going to push back? When is DeSantis going to start acting like a candidate? And even though he traveled and sounded like a candidate in Iowa this weekend, I think the contrast is going to come one day soon where he's actually going to have to say what his super PAC's commercials are saying, which is Trump's not fit.
Well, and Jeannie, as Rick just mentioned, DeSantis was in Iowa this weekend. He had the Hawkeye State to himself because President Trump had to cancel his rally because of the threat of tornadoes. Is that a win in DeSantis's book? Does it ultimately make a difference in his polling and how far behind he is in President Trump in primaries?
Yeah, and I'm still questioning, was there really a need weather-wise to cancel? Because, of course, Ron DeSantis sort of tried to show up Donald Trump by showing up in Des Moines, which wasn't on the schedule initially, very close to where Trump was supposed to have that rally, which raises all kinds of questions about whether it was a crowd issue or weather. And I do think that Ron DeSantis had a good weekend this weekend. It was better, quite frankly, than the last month or two has been for him. But I think the reality is he's trying to make this case that he should be the nominee for the party because the party under Donald Trump has been losing. But if he keeps saying that, at some point somebody is going to pin him down and say, Governor, did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election? And he's going to have to say very clearly, yes, he did, which may rankle a lot of Republicans, particularly primary voters. So he's trying to walk this very fine line, and I think it's going to be difficult for him to do because reporters at some point are going to pin him down if somebody else doesn't.
Governor DeSantis was doing some glad handing. He's in Iowa. Rick, you know the game there as well as anyone. And some are suggesting this might have been, look at this shot here, DeSantis 2.0. He's been dinged repeatedly on not having a very, big personality, for lack of a better word. And now I'm seeing Donald Trump on Truth Social referring to him as Rob DeSanctimonious. The question is, he says, is Rob just young, inexperienced, and naive, or more troubling, a fool with no idea what he's doing? First of all, what's the Rob all about? Is he trying to actually pretend he doesn't know his name? And is this DeSantis 2.0?
Yeah, this is a little bit of DeSantis 1.50.
Okay, not quite
DeSantis hasn't had many opportunities to do retail politics, but he's been criticized heavily by Donald Trump and his folks. that he's stiff and he's not a very friendly guy, and they rolled out a whole campaign against him. And reality is, before DeSantis is even announced for president, he's taken a full shot from Donald Trump. Yeah. TV ads, public appearances, constant hitting. And this was his coming out where he could say, you know what, I'm setting all that behind me. I'm going to start acting like a candidate, even if I haven't announced. And the retail politics he did in Iowa was pretty good, right? Hit 3 of the biggest cities in Iowa. He did a nice job interacting with small groups. And I think people are now saying, wow, maybe there's a there with him.
Huh, okay. So
but
Rob's
look,
getting it
calling
done
him
for
Rob, that's just psychops, right? He's getting in his head, and he's getting us to talk about him. I mean, on a day when Donald Trump really didn't have a good weekend because he bailed out of Iowa for whatever reason, he's kind of picking up the sticks today, and he's seeing all this positive press that DeSantis is getting off the trip, and you can imagine he's just stirring down there. No telling, probably bogeyed the first hole on his right.
We cannot confirm that.
We're going to leave it on that note. Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital Partner, and Jeannie Shanzano of Iona University, a political science professor there. Thank you both so much for joining us. And, Joe, that's going to wrap it up for us on this Monday.
You said it.
We go to Tuesday and that meeting at the White House.
Big meeting tomorrow. We'll have it all covered for you here tomorrow on Balance of Power. For Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Bloomberg.